So we're very excited to have everyone here today. We've got our ESIT plenary with Kira Sullivan Wiley, and I get the joy of introducing her today. So I met Kira last year at a different workshop where I got to hear her talk about co-production, and it was just like I kept having all of these little like aha moments because I kept seeing ESIP reflected in some of the examples that she was sharing. So I'm very excited for you all to hear from Kira today and to have a really lovely discussion. So, without further ado, Kira Sullivan Wiley is joining us from the Pew Charitable Trust. She's a senior officer in the Conservation Science Division there, and she leads Pew's work related to the impact of its environmental programs on people. So really that intersection between our environment and our human ecosystems as well. So she particularly focuses on how the trust conservation work affects human well-being, behavior, and decision making. And as a part of this, she has been supporting Pew's efforts to understand how large-scale conservation activity might engage with and support local communities for their mutual benefit. So please join me in welcoming Kira.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I am going to try to share my screen. Hopefully this works. Are you seeing my whales? My whale tails?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay,
the
great.
whale tail.
And now you are hopefully seeing my title slide.
Yes.
If at any time something appears to be wonky, just let me know and I will try to correct. But yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you, Allison, for that really lovely introduction. As Allison said, I'm at the Pew Charitable Trusts. My background is also just in human environment geography, and I would be happy to talk about some of my earlier research just to sort of set the stage here to now I don't personally do much research anymore. I work a lot with people who are doing a lot of implementation. So I used to be an academic and I've shifted a lot more into the implementation side of things. So kind of work on the ground, work with people, a lot of work with decision makers and policymakers. And so that's kind of the perspective that I'm going to bring today from my personal experience, but broadly too, I'm going to draw on some examples from Pew and from my colleagues and what they're working on, and some of the examples there. So, I've promised the organizers I'm going to try to keep this brief because one, I'm recovering from a bit of a cough, so my voice hopefully will stay, but might also give out. So asking for some grace there. But also just because Q&A or discussion is a lot more interesting. And so I'll hopefully kind of introduce some concepts and give some examples and yeah, and actually a lot of the things that were showing up in the chat are going to be showing up in this presentation. So hopefully there will be a lot of space to kind of dig in towards the end. But first, what I want to do is just kind of give an overview of co-production and how I think about it, how it's discussed in literature, kind of a what it is and what it isn't. And so one of the first uses of the term co-production that I've come across is from Eleanor Ostrom. So for folks who are familiar with Eleanor Ostrom's work, and it was a descriptive kind of definition. It was a recognition that policies and things aren't in practice actually just handed down kind of from governments to the public, but they are kind of there is some iteration there. There is a social response to policy. There's that policies and the way they're implemented is actually a co-produced, that those are a co-produced kind of product. And so but that first description or those first definitions they were more descriptive of kind of what was actually happening on the ground. Whereas we've shifted into more recently and in other spheres, it's more common to talk about co-production more as like the objective, like we're actively trying to co-produce things for various reasons, but that there's a sort of normative thing to it, the normative definition of like this is what we should do, and this is something that we're looking for. And so before I get into sort of defining what that is, just wanted to take a moment to kind of recognize that there's this co-ecosystem. So this is a paper by Hakaran and others on transdisciplinary science and practice and resource management. But they wanted to, so one of the lovely things that they did in their paper was to define how some of these things all fit together. So co-production um, is covers sort of the process in blue on the top here, and coincides with social learning or co-learning. And again, and the emphasis through all of these is on the idea of doing things together, doing things with each other, as opposed to for. And so other terms that are in here, like participatory research, you can think of interactive research, mode two science, post-normal science, transdisciplinary or engaged scholarship, translational ecology, action research. These are all flavors of the same idea. So I'm not going to spend too much time kind of getting bogged down in terminology. I want to focus more on sort of that the main thing that brings all these concepts together is that they're putting the emphasis on doing things with, not for, right? And so for that, or in that space, there's there's a recognition that there's a product. That product might be knowledge, that product might be a tool or a toolkit, that product might be a piece of software, that product might be a policy, that there's like a thing that is ideally going to be used by somebody, or it will be implemented by somebody, and that the creation of that thing might also involve other people, right? And so again, a model that has been used historically is that there are a bunch of experts who are experts in a topic, uh, like in that policy or in that space, who historically might have just created that product and then handed it off to the user, and sort of fingers crossed that that would get implemented well or used appropriately. And the idea of co-doing or co-production, as is the shorthand I'm going to use, but that co-production is really this idea that you bring those folks to the same place, so that the folks who are going to use it are also involved in design, and that the folks in design have a better understanding of use, and that all of that kind of can come into a magic sauce that makes a product that is more useful. So like the content is better, whatever that content is, that it's usable, so that there's like the interface, or like the mechanism through which that is delivered, is more usable, user friendly maybe, and that things are more likely to be used. And this is a place where like the act of co-production and the process of co-production are really important, and I'll get into more detail on that later. But palatability, um, desire for it, expectations, and sense of ownership are all really important. Um, and I also just want to pause here to say that co-production or collaboration, right, is not a new idea. People have been doing things with each other forever, right? We're a social species, within communities, within families, within groups of people that are really tightly coordinated or related to each other. This kind of behavior, kind of co-producing things, is very common and relatively intuitive. Um, Much of the literature and sort of the focus and the practice of co-production now, or like why we put emphasis on it, um, is that especially when you're moving across communities or across teams or across agencies or across groups of people who don't traditionally work together or don't have close existing relationships necessarily, that it's a more sort of structured, intentional way of bringing that together and building the kind of doing this on purpose, towards a shared common goal, which I'm really glad that language of sort of shared vision and shared goal came up a lot in the chat. Um, it is not, however, everything, right? Co-production is not, it's not generally kind of basic science or theoretical science. So if you're doing a project where the goal is to just get a sense of where the limits of knowledge are, or what the limit of the potential of something is, or you're building towards a kind of theory, often co-production isn't necessarily necessary for that. There's not the user of that might be the producer, right? It's a sort of a more closed loop. And so co-production might not be necessary for that, even though you're producing something, right? It's also not, and I won't go into tons of detail about this, but I do want to put the point up front that co-production is not free, right? There are really real costs associated with time. The time, I think this was also in the time and energy resources, the like financial and other capital resources that go into having to do the process of co-production, even identifying who those sort of team members might be to do the co-production work. There's also, and this gets some attention in the literature, of like sort of psychosocial cost, right? There can be, when you bring different groups of people together, there are things that are harder, right? There's interpersonal relationships, people are navigating power dynamics, which we'll talk about later. There can be sort of expertise threat, right? A sense of you can have more imposter syndrome, right? You feel like you have to prove yourself to a whole new set of people. There are all kinds of sort of psychosocial frictions or challenges that can come up, and those are real and important and might be more salient in other contexts than others, but there's something to be aware of. And so because of all of these things, co-production is not always appropriate. It's not always sort of the right way forward. And I put a citation here in the bottom, a paper by Maria Carmen Lemos and others back in 2018 called To Co-Produce or Not to Co-Produce. It's short, it's like 3 pages. I highly recommend reading it for folks who are struggling with that concept of like, well, what are the costs? It's also just kind of a really good primer on the concept of co-production. That said, when it is appropriate, it is often sort of the best and sometimes the only way to get things done really well. It is, it can be kind of essential. So that's all kind of vague hand wavy background. And there are a lot of resources that go into, oh, and I didn't fix this. It looks like I have a bad animation on the next slide, but we'll ignore that. So there are a lot of resources that go deeper into this topic, but to provide a kind of basic overview of the components or the steps of co-production, and it's not a linear process. I'm going to present it slightly like a linear process, but I'm going to use a food analogy just because food is hopefully for most of us very accessible, something we're quite familiar with. And so the analogy is going to be about food. Really, it can relate to any kind of product. So we're going to talk about a meal for a bunch of people, like some sort of big collaborative meal. But really, hopefully I'll give some illustrative comments throughout that show how this is more applicable more broadly. And so the essential steps here that I'm going to go over are goals. So goals and vision. So A+ for mentioning that first. Importance of goals and vision, teams, so building the team, tasks and constraints, roles and responsibilities, and then this last term being iterate, right? Iteration and iterative process are really key concepts when it comes to co-production, and sort of what that looks like and where the bounds on that are is also really important to consider. So here's where, so ignore the circles and lines all the way on the right. Focus on the left. So first we have a product identified. And so this can be, and actually before we define a product, ideally you're talking about goals and vision. So the goal here, you might start, in a lot of teams, you start with a product before they go back to a goal, but really, even if you think you have the product in mind, like, oh, we want to do this meal, think about, okay, hopefully there's someone in the room who says, well, let's step back. Why are we doing a meal in the first place? What's the meal for? What are we hoping to accomplish with the meal? What's our like vision for that? Or what are the goals, right? And so the goal might actually be create a space where a bunch of, where these family members who don't get to see each other very often can come together and, build their social ties, right? Probably if you're planning a meal, you won't make it explicit like that, but you could. And in my family, I might, because I'm a social scientist. But try to make explicit, like, why are we doing this in the first place? What's the goal? What are we hoping to accomplish? You don't necessarily have to get right into metrics right away, but kind of why are we doing this? What are we doing this for? Maybe who's the audience, right? You might start building some of that. You might have a vision statement that you want to build in that people can refer to. And this is something I did an exercise like this recently for a conservation organization where they had a bunch of different players coming together to co-create a vision. And what we ended up doing was using AI. So this is a place where AI can be kind of helpful in like drafting language, especially for such a kind of core thing where you can have people who get tied to certain language and who are excited about certain things, where you put a whole bunch of language from the different parties into an AI and have this like neutral third party draft a mission statement or a vision statement for the group that the group can then iterate on, but where like the default initial language was actually created by a third party, not by one drafter who's like a person with their own sort of perspective and agenda, right? So that's like, and I think there are sessions on AI here, and I don't know if it was probably more technical and talking about coding and stuff, but that is a place that I've used AI to have that sort of third party, neutral party play a role. But ideally, you start out with a sort of goal and the vision, and then you have a conversation about who are my stakeholders, right? So who's likely to be affected by the process of this sort of meal event creation? And actually, before I go into that, part of the visioning is also scope identification. So figuring out sort of what are, or at least an idea, a draft of what you think the edges of that process are, right? So the vision should ideally have a, what's the context, maybe who are the families, maybe it's spatial, maybe it's temporal, maybe it's uh, the who, but the kind of the who, what, when, where, why of the project or of the product or of the activity at hand. Uh, Scope comes into that kind of visioning step. Then coming to the team, right? So who is likely to be affected by the process and its outcomes? Who's going to maybe host, right? You start going through who's going to be affected. Well, somebody, or who needs to be involved. We got to have it somewhere. So whoever's hosting it, that would be like a stakeholder or a rights holder, somebody, an interested party. Who's going to be procuring the raw materials, right? In our case, that would be who's going grocery shopping. But this could be, who's collecting the data, who's providing the data. Maybe it's already been collected, but it's stored somewhere. Who's the data provider? Who's going to be preparing? Who's doing the analysis? Who's the chef? Who are the chefs in the kitchen? Who are going to do stuff, manipulate those raw materials? Where is it going to be stored? And then who's going to be consuming it, right? And depending on your project, there are going to be more different kind of steps here. But basically, you follow the flow of a little bit of what's going to happen, but who's going to be affected by that process and the outcome. And so these, I would say, team, tasks, and constraints, there's a lot of iteration that happens between these three kind of components of this, because as you're thinking of the team, you're also thinking of the tasks. What are the things that kind of have to get done in order to get us from where we are to the product? And this is also a place where a theory of change or a results chain can come in, where you're starting to build, okay, we're starting from wherever we're starting from. We have initial conditions. We need to get to a final product. We have the people who are doing that, and then we have the tasks that are going to come as a part of that. And so the tasks might be things like decision making. Who's coming up with the ideas of, in our example, this might be who's coming up with what dishes there should be, who's going to be coming up with the meal plan, how much food we need, some of that. And each of those tasks and alongside each of those people is going to come constraints. And so in our example, constraints might be things like allergies, food preferences, lifestyle, things like that. Whereas in another example, it might be constraints on software or hardware. There might be constraints related to data sovereignty. I think it was a Joseph Gum, maybe yesterday, I attended this kind of thing on data sovereignty, right? Who owns the data and what are the limitations on that? Like, rights and rights and preferences, and sort of, you might have cultural things here, time, energy, measuring progress through metrics of success might be something that you come in through here. And then you go through your list, right? Other things that have to get done. Somebody has to do the shopping. That's going to be constrained by markets and maybe finances, right? Do we have enough money to procure those data? Do we have, is there even a market that has the supply of the thing that we need? Do we need to go a step back? And so here, again, this is where the iteration comes in. You might run up against a constraint where you need to add a new team member. You say, actually, we need a funder to come in here. We need and maybe this is like an in-kind kind of fundraising. Maybe we need a skill set that we really don't have on the team that we thought we needed, because we have a new task or a new constraint. So it's not always people who have the expertise for the task that you're doing, but a team member might also be just addressing a constraint. And then you go through this iteration, right? Who's cooking the meal, who's serving it, or tasks related to, right, preparation, or analysis or whatever, serving, the actual sort of transfer of that product to the end user in our case being the people sitting down at the meal and eating it. All of those also come with constraints around preferences, time, resources, things like that. And you might have cleanup. Now, this is a really important area to reference back to your scope and your vision, right? at this stage, when you're thinking of all the tasks, especially when you're thinking who can be impacted by this, it's depending again how what your context is, you can go way off the rails here, right? It's easy to say like, well, like in our case, we might say like, oh, well, like maybe if we depending on how much we prepare, if we over prepare food and we have some left over, maybe we would donate that to a local, like food distribution center, or we would, or we, like compost leftovers, and how are we going to get rid of the compost? Do we need to contact compost? And like those are groups that might be impacted, but then you have to get back to your team and say like, okay, is the impact that this product or this project that we're working on to that end user or to that potential impacted party, like is that, where are we vis-a-vis the threshold and the scope of our project? Is that outside scope or is that inside scope? And that's sometimes a conversation, right? It's not always completely intuitive to all parties where that line is, but having that discussion can be really important. And so you might decide like, you know what, we don't need to involve the food pantry in this discussion. Maybe I'll check with them to see if they would accept food if we have extra food. And if so, if there are any like constraints on that, but we're not actually going to add them in as a team member to make like core decisions about what we prepare in the first place and how we do this whole product, right? And so, but I think doing that initial kind of brainstorming and ideation is really important to see like kind of you do like one step out so that you can do that one step back and say like, no, actually we have defined our scope pretty well. We do know who needs to be involved, and we can move forward with that. And that might be trade-off. Those might entail trade-offs too, right? Like you can exclude people, individuals, entities, interested parties, and you just need to be able to sort of defend that choice and know that maybe you are missing out on a perspective, but is it a key perspective or is it not? Again, referencing back that there are costs to doing co-production, to adding people in, especially because as they get added in, they can have, ideally, they'll have opinions about, and they'll have, that there's an opportunity for them to reflect on the vision, and potentially, a new party, like you bring in a new funder, that funder might have ideas about who should be involved, and it might not be the team that you've chosen, right? Or that has been chosen. And so these are all considerations, but there's a lot of iteration here. But ideally, again, one of the reasons you might develop a theory of change or some document, why you want to have your vision statement kind of written out and agreed upon, why you might want to have a theory of change kind of spelled out, that's like a map of what you plan to do and what you think the effects of those things are going to be. That helps new people who are entering the partnership kind of get up to speed on what's already been decided and why things lead to other things, stuff like that. And the last step here, excuse me, is going to the roles and responsibilities space. So this is mapping out who is going to do what. And so in a lot of cases, as we've described, building your team and coming up with your task and your constraints and building your theory of change, by the time you get to this point, it might be pretty obvious who's going to do what. But there's still the work of clarifying those roles and responsibilities. And this is another place where, especially when you're bringing in groups of people who haven't always historically worked together, being as clear as possible about the roles and responsibilities and kind of expectations, timelines, things like that. You might have a work plan. That piece can be incredibly important. Now, this is like an audience participation portion, and Allison will be familiar with this, but so I guess people have access to the chat, right? So has anyone been a part of, maybe not hosted, but perhaps hosted a big meal like this before? Either attended, you've been engaged in a large meal. So my question is, can you tell me who often becomes the default doer of all the things, right? When there's a big meal, there's in my experience, there's a sort of default doer of the thinking of what the meals should be, what the dishes should be, who goes shopping for those ingredients, who prepares them, who serves them, sometimes who cleans up after them, who pays for it. If we can use the chat function. Now I can't see the chat. Can I see the chat? I might be able to see the chat. Can I do this? Is anyone writing anything in the chat?
Kira, we can help read off what we're seeing.
Yes. Oh, okay. No, I can see it now. Yes, the host, the matriarch, mom, The host is the default. Yes. Oh, Denise. Excellent. Mom, me. So, okay, so we've got a Carl and a Mark who are me. That's good for gender equity. Yes. Yes, the host, usually me. We've got a Nazila. Yes, sister of the bride. Yes, so this is great. Me from my mom's model. Yes. Yeah, so this is expected. And yeah, so often the host and because we live in a gendered society, it's often the female host who ends up doing all of this stuff. And so this is in part because there is often so the reason I illustrate this is because, one, go moms, but second, or hosts, not to be too gendered about it, but we, in a lot of co-production cases, there is a default. And sometimes that's because it's the entity who received the initial funding or who controls the most money. Sometimes it's somebody else. Maybe it's for expertise reasons. Maybe it's the PI who submitted the grant proposal, whatever it is. There's often a kind of default doer of all the things. And that's often not great, right? They're like, for in our example, the host might not be the best cook, might not have the most money. Maybe they're the host because they have the biggest house, or they have a table that can seat the most people, and that's why they get chosen, or they're in a centralized location. It doesn't mean that they're the best cook. It doesn't mean they have access to the best groceries. It doesn't mean, they have the best china or whatever. But because they're the host, there's kind of a tacit assumption among all the guests and all the other people involved that even if they're not the default doer of all the things, they're at least the default delegator. And it becomes their responsibility to be like the project manager. So what I want to talk about is the importance of facilitators or professional project managers, people who do not have a role in the co-production space beyond being the project manager, beyond facilitation, beyond making sure that all the pieces are doing well, making sure that the roles and responsibilities are allocated appropriately and are being followed up on. And the reason you would do this, or there is a lot that goes into being a role of facilitator, and we can talk about that a lot later if you'd like, but it can be a key role. And even if you don't sort of outsource this and have like a professional facilitator, having someone who's sort of designated as the facilitator, who just doesn't have other responsibilities besides being a facilitator, can be a really, really helpful thing to help co-production go smoothly. And we can talk about sort of the why of that later on, but it can be a really, really important role. And I wanted to make just another point on iteration. Iteration does not necessarily mean, so iteration should be happening kind of all through this. You're taking a step back, new people come in, new perspectives. Even as a group, once you've had your group sort of settled, you might want to go back to your theory of change, check in on that periodically, and say, like, is this still, how are we going? And so having milestones can really help with that. So you have sort of set checkpoints when you set up your theory of change in the first place, and you say, like, here are places where we're going to sort of check back in to see what our progress looks like, make sure that we're still kind of going in the direction that we want to go, we're making the progress we want to make, etc. But iteration also does not mean that you're reinventing the wheel every time, right? You're checking to make sure you're still on the right track. Are we still achieving? Are we still going the direction of our vision? Do we need to bring new people in if and when they come on? It's sort of the I always picture this kind of like, you have this like, sort of potential diagrams that have, I don't know what direction I'm going, but presumably from left to right, how, you start off kind of narrow, but with like really broad potential in the end. And ideally that sort of narrows as you move along. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about why that analogy is in my head, but that's how I think about it, right? You're not just sort of like looping back around and going willy-nilly. There is structure to it, and there are constraints and limitations. So and the last thing I want to say on this slide is also, like, there are a lot of components here, but the reason I use a food analogy is also because you've probably already done this, right? Different families coming together, having to negotiate different social norms. Even if you feel like you haven't done co-production in the past, or you're not sure what it takes to be successful, I would encourage you to kind of reflect on times when you've done something like this, where different groups had to come together. You had to negotiate roles and responsibilities. People had different preferences that you had to manage. It's not impossible. You've probably already done something like it. And just, the abstraction of the different steps can be a helpful, to me, kind of format to go through. Moving on. So why put all of that work in, right? I just talked about having that it can be a significant amount of effort and time to go through that. First of all, is that co-production kind of shares the load, right? It's not just the host coming up with the ideas, making all the decisions, doing all the tasks, which can lead to burnout, can lead to explosions of frustration and temper at critical times, like during the meal, right? When nobody's even helping me clean up, right? We want to avoid that. We don't want burnout. We want everyone to sort of be doing what they need to do and to feel supported. Also, reduces the likelihood of unintended negative impacts. In our case, that would be something like allergic reactions. But in other cases, it's, like avoiding like incompatible software or hardware where like you get to the end and it turns out that product can't be used by the end user, or it would be way too much effort or energy for them to use it, and it's like too big of a lift and the product just gets torpedoed. Finally, not finally, the next one is that everyone feels more ownership over it. So this was something that I think Denise maybe was alluding to earlier, but this kind of effect of like, when you've contributed to something, or maybe it was Allison's thing about the dance and the dancers sort of taking ownership over their own role in their learning and their education and their sort of dance practice. But the meal kind of tastes sweeter for having contributed to it, right? There's the Lemos paper that I mentioned earlier cites several really good studies that demonstrate that this effect on in like farming communities and others where the sort of end user has a role in the development of whatever product is going to be rolled out to them, they're way more likely to pick it up. They're like, oh yeah, this is mine. They have a bit of pride of product in that. There's also efficiency and quality of research products. You're leveraging different expertise instead of relying on kind of that default person to have all the relevant expertise to leverage it, or to like know whose expertise to draw on and to delegate, which is a huge amount of effort and not always super efficient or effective. And also I want to highlight, so I was looking at the sessions and it looks like there's one after this on NOAA fisheries, an open science initiative. And so I think that would be, I'm hoping to attend to that, but looking at sort of, I'm eager to learn more about that myself, but kind of this efficiency and quality of scientific products coming out of kind of co-production models being one of the potential effects. And the last one that I want to mention is around, so there's a Nordstrom paper from 2020 that, and I also have a list of, there's a bibliography that I have a slide on, so you'll all get all of these citations if you're interested in doing more reading. But there's a benefit related to developing capacity, building networks, social capital, and helping people make better decisions. So you have a sort of the individual people in the collaboration, right? The partners themselves having individual benefits that come from having been a part of that partnership, right? You sort of get the that added benefit. So one of the examples that I wanted to talk about was that, so the LenFest Ocean program is a grant making program within Pew, or that's partially funded. It's a collaborative grant making program from the LenFest family and the Pew Charitable Trusts, but they're a grant making program, and their model is that they do anyway, they fund scientific research that's meant to influence policy, or it's at least at the funding point, it's meant to be policy relevant. With the goal of that influencing policy. And so these are the 4 categories that they've come up with for research impact, all of which are sort of facilitated to greater or lesser extents by co-production. But these are kind of outcomes that they're looking for from what they produce. So the first one is just contributing to science. Excuse me, water break. The first one is contributing to science. So this would be like, the scientists that they fund publish something in the peer-reviewed literature, maybe the gray literature, but they've contributed to science somehow. The second one is in prompting dialogue. Prompting dialogue could be among, people are talking about it. There's some buzz. The third is that so that decision-making, management, or policy are informed. And this one is a little bit tricky. It's sort of like, you know, that the relevant policymakers in the Lenfest Ocean Program will mediate this, but we'll bring policymakers and the science together to kind of talk about it, or like in like good dialogue, kind of learn about it. And the last one is that decision-making, management, or policy are actually influenced by that science. And this is, again, right, you can have qualitative metrics where you talk to someone about like what information they used in writing up a particular policy. You can also measure this through like actual language from the scientific paper that ends up in the policy report or the brief that happened, that sort of informs that policy. But this is, and I would love to talk more about the Lenfest Ocean Program too, which I will a little bit later. A really interesting model for funders leaning into to funding co-production, because there's not enough of that. So that's sort of the what and the why of co-production, sort of how you do it, what it looks like, why you might do it, what the benefits are. But there are also some related terms that kind of come up in the ecosystem of co-production, or the co-ecosystem, right, that are kind of related terms. And so I want to talk briefly also about power, boundary spanning, and EDIJ or JEDI, and what that looks like. So first of all, power dynamics. So there are two sort of distinct ways that I think about power dynamics when it comes to co-production. The first is like related to more kind of the history of co-production. So history of co-production is there was a lot in policymaking, like I was talking about with Eleanor Ostrom, a lot in sort of health services, also in education, also in indigenous or post-colonial engagement. That's where a lot of the co-production in environmental conservation comes into play. But in all of those cases, right, between healthcare providers and patients, between teachers and students, between government and public, between sort of colonial government and indigenous government, you have really stark power dynamics, historical, embedded, sort of socially mediated power dynamics of sort of perceived authority, perceived disempowerment, things like that. And so those are, in those examples, sort of very obvious or very easy to see, I guess, even from an external party. But I would argue that even in, among government agencies, among different fields in academia, among people in the same organization who are more junior and more senior, there are still power dynamics. And in any kind of co-production space, being aware of what those are, and sort of especially perceived authority and perceived sort of self-perceptions of voice and legitimacy are really critical to just be aware of and to map out. There's an exercise, a tool called the Power Cube that I've come across that is, or that was shared with me. It seems like a really cool resource for helping to do that kind of mapping, that kind of power mapping of like who has power, who doesn't, from a sort of perceived authority perspective. That's really interesting. The other kind of power I want to talk about is one that was created by this guy, Dr. Ken Blanchard, whose PhD in organizational leadership. And this is from a course that he does on self-leadership. Sorry, my throat's starting to dry out. Almost time for me to be done talking. But the creators of this call it the 5 points of power. I like to call it the power star. Allison might be familiar with me saying that. So the power star, as I like to call it, it describes 5 different types of power. And these are really useful things for, first of all, just yourself, right? This is actually, it comes from a self-leadership course where you like are supposed to recognize your own sources of power and how to leverage them in like the workplace to be more effective and, advocate for yourself and stuff like that. I would argue it's also really a good exercise to go through or to be thoughtful of in a co-production space where you're looking at not just the expertise of like the sort of on paper expertise, like what's the field that the different team members are coming from and what they're bringing, but also the sources of power that they have and how they might want to bring those to the co-production process and activities that you're doing. So different types of power help people to accomplish things. And the first one is position power. So this is power that's derived from holding a position where you're managing people or controlling resources. This is maybe the most obvious one, right? You're the boss, you have power because of that. The next one down here on the bottom right is personal power. So this is power that's derived from kind of your character, your passion, your persistence, your charisma, your wisdom. It can also be like interpersonal skills, people who are just like really persuasive communicators. I feel like we all know this person where like you could, their phrases like you could sell. I don't know. Now I'm totally blanking on what those examples are. Feel free to put them in the chat. Like that person could sell hats to a hat maker. I don't know what they are. They're like, I feel like they're really funny phrases. Maybe my friends from the South know them better. But yes, so personal power, right? Just people who have that charisma, have that wisdom, have something that lets them accomplish things. You can also have task power. So this is power that's derived from the ability to help or delay the completion of a task, right? We know these people too, those folks who can just, they can smooth everything over. So you're like, oh my God, I had that ask, or we needed that thing done, and then they just do it. And it's so smooth and so seamless and it's done. And that's amazing. Often those same people have the power to really delay the completion of that task, right? Being whatever the incredibly inefficient or not, that can be a choice, but that there's power that comes from that positionality related to a particular task. Knowledge power. So this is, I'll press the button, knowledge power. So this is having experience or skills in a particular area. And the point to emphasize here too, because we already sort of talked about expertise, but this can be sort of formal schooling expertise, but it can also be lived experience, having done or experienced something in the past. That's a form of knowledge. Social, cultural knowledge, indigenous knowledge, all of those types of knowledge are, any type of knowledge is here. And the last one is relationship power. This is power that comes from associating with others or your associations with others. So folks who you might have a mentor or a champion, or you might be a personal friend to someone with one of these other types of power. And so we know those people too, right? The person who just like, oh, that person has the ear of so-and-so, or that person knows everybody. If you have a message you want to get out, like you get it to that person, they are just connected. Another type of power to recognize. And again, sort of in yourselves, I think it can be pretty empowering to kind of do this mapping for yourself, but also if you're doing that kind of team building and designation, it can be really helpful. Boundary spanning. So this is another term or bridging that comes up a lot in co-production because they're really useful in co-production spaces. So boundary spanners, and so ESIP, I would imagine, is, you call yourselves ESIP? I think so, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you. Not like AOF, where I was making up acronyms and how you would pronounce them for the other, for where we met. But yes, boundary spanners like ESIP are really useful and critical for co-production. They can be facilitators. They can be the object. So you can have boundary objects. So objects that the group is working on, organizers or entities, things like that. So I'll just run really quickly through 3 examples of types of boundary spanners. So the first is Lenfest Ocean Program. I mentioned it earlier. It's a grant making program at Pew, but they have sort of, I was going to say they have 2 feet, but they have 4 feet, one each in the space of the scientific community. So they have sort of deep relationships and expertise and knowledge on their own team of sort of, it's in the marine realm, so sort of marine sciences, and things related to that. They also have a foot in the policymaking realm. They have really good relationships, strong relationships, and a strong understanding of sort of the policy landscape kind of globally. They have a really strong sort of core function around science communication and knowing who, and they're well connected in the science communication space as well. And they have another foot, their 4th foot, is in the community, is embeddedness and expertise in the community of funders. So especially science funders, but also just sort of the funding landscape in general. So being well connected to other funders. And they leverage all of those connections to bring different teams of people together to help facilitate co-production of science that is policy relevant. Another example, so you can also have boundary people, boundary spanners as individuals. And this is, so the example here is the Center for Breeding Indigenous Knowledge and Science, or CBICS, which is an NSF funded RCN that where they want to effectively and ethically braid Western and Indigenous science, research, practice, and education. And all of the people who are associated with that program have, again, sort of one foot in each of those communities. They're people who have expertise and experience and community in Western science and in Indigenous science. And so they have sort of both of those both of those communities as things that they can sort of negotiate among. They can be really helpful as, again, sort of individual facilitators, also really helpful in really sort of well positioned to know who to talk to, sort of who team members should be, again, relevant to their related knowledges. So who people can be, also like how to run, say, like a meeting, like what should the actual meeting, what should the email look like? Should it be an email? Should this be a phone call? Like, how do you actually connect different groups of people where language, social norms, cultural norms, all that stuff might be different, goals and vision might be different, just how they talk about things, how you go about making a decision, right? Governance structures, things like that might all be different within different communities. And if you have to bring them together for a co-production purpose or a shared vision, knowing how to navigate that, it can be really helpful to have someone who's a boundary spanner who can help figure that out so that it happens well. The last example here is CIMIS or CIMIS, which is a California, the California Irrigation Management Information System. Some of you might be familiar with it. I just found it in the literature, but it's an integrated network of automated weather stations that was co-produced, or it's an object that was sort of at the center of the University of California, Davis, the UC Cooperative Extension, and the California Department of Water Resources. So you've got kind of academic institutions, quasi-academic institutions, and then state agencies working together to sort of co-produce this object that gets used by a wide range of people. I expect that a lot of the, maybe, I don't know, a lot, some of the sessions I was looking at, right, you might have like the ESIP GitHub might be considered a boundary object if it's a thing that a lot of people are kind of engaged with and working on and have a say in what it looks like and how it operates. I'm sure there are other examples coming out of this meeting that are sort of where a group of people who don't always necessarily work together are co-producing kind of an object or a product together, and kind of acting on that as a sort of separate entity. The last kind of set of terms that I want to talk about is EDIJ or JEDI, but basically justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I saw that there was an ESIP session, I think it was yesterday afternoon, on EDIJ aligned work and improving outcomes across a range of considerations. I think that's awesome. And I am really sad that I couldn't attend, but I would love to hear more about how that went. But the each of these, so justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, they relate to co-production in my mind in kind of two ways. One, they can be the justification for doing co-production. You might be like aiming at affecting one or more of these themes. No, what's the word I'm looking for? End goals. But they can also be really important considerations in sort of how you actually do co-production. And those might be related, they might be somewhat independent. So justice, this might be a goal of co-development or co-production through intentionally redistributing power in decision-making. You might be using this to correct a prior exclusion or correcting or addressing a previous harm, avoiding future harms, things like that, right? There might be a co-production like designing an early warning system for some sort of environmental hazard where where the co-production team involves the sort of EJ affected community in the design of that early warning system, for example. Equity can also be a goal, right? Recognitional equity in how team members are identified and credited, right? I've seen there is sort of an increasing recognition that Indigenous knowledge holders ought to, if they want, be included as authors on peer-reviewed papers where their knowledge is critical to the production of that paper. Right, I've seen that as an example, but using recognitional equity, you can have also sort of procedural equity in how the co-production process happens, making sure that that sort of contributions and people's efforts are facilitated in a way that is equitable. Distributional equity is another one, making sure that the beneficiaries, whoever's benefiting or whatever positive impacts or negative impacts are coming out of the co-production process are equitably distributed. And I think this is one of my favorite ones, I think, because not everybody wants the same thing. So you have the vision of like the product, but then you also have like maybe sort of those milestones or side impacts that might not be like the product itself at the end. And I think some of this was what was being discussed in the chat earlier on, was around like so for example, if you have an academic partner, that partner might really want or a team member, that person might really want academic publications, right? That's how their success is going to be measured in their home institution. So that's something that they really would like to have out of a co-production effort, if that's, if there's knowledge production as part of it. You might have an agency partner who does not care at all about a peer-reviewed paper. Sometimes you do, but maybe you don't. And you really need like a brief that will be delivered to your supervisor. Like that is the product that you need, or the benefit that you need. Whereas another, like an on the ground, a community partner might really want, like, they just want kind of the answer they need, an ongoing input of, some sort of environmental, I'm thinking of this one example where it's like a pollution level, right? They might need that to make management decisions coming on, and they don't really care about the peer-reviewed publication or the white paper about how this whole thing is set up and used. They just need the product itself to function routinely and reliably for them, for their decision making, right? So different people might want different things, and this is that doesn't necessarily fundamentally change the the product itself, but it might change how you go about achieving it, and sort of what shows up in the work plan. And that's one of the things where I think it can be really satisfying and really fun, kind of, to think about all the different components that go into that and who's going to benefit on the end, and make sure that it's benefits that those people actually care about, right? Not just things that you're like, oh, well, I value peer-reviewed publications, so you can be on that publication and that's a benefit to you. You're welcome, right? Not an appropriate distribution of benefits. The last one is inclusion, and this one is just, it's so key. Or no, sorry, diversity of team members being also just critical. If everyone is bringing the same thing to co-production, it would not be co-production, that would just be production, business as usual. The whole, the fundamental component of co-production is that you're bringing different people together. There's a diversity of perspectives and expertise and power that's going into that to make it richer and better. Inclusion is also key to the design of any co-production process, right? Making sure that the way engagement and work is structured makes diverse participants feel welcomed, valued, heard, respected, because they are, right? This is like a thoughtful, reflective, sincere process. I think probably all of us, I certainly have, right, been in a place where you did not feel, you're like, oh, they don't want me here. This is not my space. I don't feel like I belong, or I don't feel welcome, right? Which are slightly different things, but of kind of, they can be related. And that is not a good feeling. And especially if you're intentional, if you want to reap the benefits of co-production, making sure that that is not a feeling that the people who are coming to the co-production team have is very important, right? Making sure that inclusivity is kind of built into the structure of it. I'm going to skip over this one because this is just sort of an illustration from a Chambers and others paper, who in Nature Sustainability, talking about sort of the different goals you might have for co-production. Some of it can be about redistributing power. And then this is the last slide, just a couple of final ideas for sort of food for thought. This can seed discussion questions. It can also just be kind of for your own reflection. But thinking about sort of, should I be doing co-production and I'm not, right? So thinking about what you're working on that can or should be used by somebody else, maybe as a space for like, could I lightly explore maybe the idea of co-producing this? So I won't go deep into depth on this. I have slides on it that I could draw up if people have questions, but basically there's also like a spectrum of engagement. Not everything that is engaged research or sort of, there can be like co-production light, right? Where you have kind of different levels of engagement, where you have like full co-production all the way on one end, but there are lighter versions of that have a lighter touch. that should be sort of fit to purpose, right? Another sort of key takeaway, reflecting on positionality and power, your own, those of the team members. This is just a really critical sort of overarching theme that needs to be part of co-production, a kind of constant reflection. One on sort of defining what success looks like. What are the impacts of the work? I think this is like pretty much the chat question at the beginning. I agree, it's a really good one. But thinking of that, being thoughtful about that. And then some good practices, happy to talk about any of these more, but again, sort of mechanisms of accountability and feedback, regardless of how well something is designed on the front end, having a way that people can provide feedback to let you know how it's going as it goes on is just really important. Making norms explicit, sometimes that's at the beginning of the talk or at the beginning of any kind of session or workshop or collaboration, just actually explicitly stating what the norms are and what sort of our expectations of each other are. And having people be able to add to that or have a problem with it or whatever, right? Having that be sort of co-produced norms very intentionally. Avoiding jargon and acronyms, just sort of general best practice. And then checking back on anything that's been paraphrased by anything else. So like if whoever's facilitating this is like also facilitation 101, if anyone is paraphrasing something else that someone else expressed, checking back to make sure that that was properly paraphrased, that things weren't missed or misconstrued. And the last final point is also, this is a practice like yoga, right? Where you give yourself grace and also hold yourself accountable, and give others grace and also hold them accountable. There's, I think both of those are sort of equally important to emphasize. And with that, my voice is completely given out. So moving on to discussion. Thank you. I think, is it Denise will facilitate discussion? Okay.
Yes, I will. Sorry.
Great.
Was not moving very fast to get to the unmute button. I love how you closed with the with reminding us about grace and accountability, because I think that is something that's often lacking, particularly grace to ourselves. Particularly when we're working in spaces like this, we often, as researchers, as scientists, we're so used to being very critical of ourselves, or holding ourselves to high standards and not giving ourselves that grace. So I think that to me is a really lovely, lovely reminder that we need to do that.
Yeah.
We've got some great questions in chat. Or in Slido, please keep adding and upvoting. We're going to start with a question, and I'm going to add a little bit to this question. It seems funders aren't thrilled necessarily to fund the facilitator role, or when budgets get tight, it's the first to go. Related, you brought up near the end, a lot of these things may seem to fall or fall under kind of that EDIJ umbrella, which, as we know in the US, is being very directly attacked. How can we advocate for the inclusion of co-production, these the necessary facilitators, and these things that often are seen as extra?
Yeah. Really good question. So, so there are maybe three responses that I, yeah, really good question. And I think, preface all of my responses being like, probably many of them will be really unsatisfying because I won't have the answer. But giving myself grace, so I have a couple of thoughts. First is, I hear you. Yeah, it is often something that, and depending on the funding source, professional facilitation is, I agree, sort of sometimes seen as an extra, even though it's just like fundamental. So I would say, so one is, and I can probably share some of these resources. But I can also do more digging to try to figure out, to try to find the, like, sort of the evidence base for making the argument that a designated facilitator, maybe not, so designated facilitator is a critical sort of budget point. That said, there are ways to reap some of the benefits of specific facilitators without having like an entire separately funded full-time person. I've seen really successful models where there's like, you figure out exactly how much time of someone's time is required to do it, without overwhelming that person, right? So again, sort of designating clear responsibilities. There are also sort of times within trying to just make it cheaper, right? So times within a co-production process where a professional facilitator or a designated facilitator is maybe more critical. So like really early on, getting the table set, getting roles and responsibilities designated, figuring out who should do what, getting that vision statement clear, getting the theory of change or whatever it is, the work plan sort of pretty much settled, like well drafted with reasonable buy-in, like that's a pretty critical step. You might be able to do that in like a 2-day workshop. It depends what the project is, right? But I've seen, a conservation plan, for example, have a professional facilitator who does a lot of the front end work. It's in a couple of days. So you might be able to reduce costs that way, where you're not hiring necessarily a whole project manager, but you're getting your sort of targeted facilitation in at the critical points, right? And so maybe not fully ideal, but you're still getting sort of that core function. The second one I'll say is that this is one space. So one of the reasons I mentioned LenFest and as a funder, and one of the key sort of relationships that they have is in that funding community. And so that's one space. So there are two places at Pew where Pew as a funder. So Pew has its own sort of interesting history. It used to be a grant making organization like a foundation, and now it's a 501c3, but we still sort of retain some of that grant making legacy. But one of the things that whole community, or there are actors within the broader sort of funding community trying to move that needle. There's a lot that's not equitable in grant making, as it's been done historically. There's a lot of, where there's, the way RFPs are written and reviewed, and there are lots of inequities, and even the way like grants are managed, there's a huge burden sometimes on especially smaller or like less well-funded institutions, like small organizations, community-based organizations, individuals who are just, and that's a lot of places where DEIJ is coming in, where there's like, a small organization that can't compete with like McKinsey is also writing a grant application. You're like, these are not going to be the same grant, or they're not going to look the same, right? That proposal is not going to look the same, and making sure that you're, as the grant maker, trying to level that playing field. So there is movement, I would say, in the funder space to try to recognize where those unfairnesses and inequities are and try to address them. It is a bit of a slow moving behemoth-y kind of machine. But there's a team at Pew who is, I forgot now what the consortium is, but they've built in 2 ways. So they're standing up an organization. It's called like University Presidents Consortium of University Presidents, but basically trying to restructure some of the stuff in academia to make academics coming into co-production and contributing to co-production actually not harm them in the long term for like tenure and stuff like that. But trying to sort of, so some of those more kind of systemic things, that's not the DEIJ or facilitator piece, but it is another sort of avenue of where that's happening. Also trying to do that in the funder space of saying like, hey, doing co-production is hard work. Here are ways, and I'm trying to think of, there's a recent paper, I don't think it's in the bibliography, but I can share it later. There are 2 that I'm thinking of that are specifically targeting sort of funding co-production and like what that should look like in the peer reviewed literature. So I can maybe, are you taking notes to like remind me?
I'm trying to take notes, but yes.
No, I'll make a note. It'll just take me a second. So Angela,
Yes.
so the 2 funders papers, and they were written by, so the Lemos paper is the co-production, to co-produce or not, was co-authored by a colleague of mine, who is really connected in this space. Another paper was co-authored by someone from the LenFest program. So they're really trying to sort of move and shake that field. The last thing I want to say about this is that it's also possible. So one of the things that my team has invested in is also just ramping up the sort of the facilitation skill set of non-professional facilitators. So people like me who, like, sometimes I'm called on to facilitate things, but I'm not a professional facilitator. That is not my full-time job, but I'll get called in to help run a workshop. And I'm like, I don't want to do a crappy job. So I have, taken like a, 20-hour course on how to be a better facilitator, or there are things like that where if that's a role you see yourself potentially playing, or someone on your team, right? So like you can distribute this as a resource, but doing that investment in sort of just professional development of your people, or yourself, of like becoming a better facilitator, because a lot of facilitation it's like being aware of power dynamics, having a toolkit for different types of exercises that you do, instead of saying, if anyone has an idea, raise your hand and we'll go around the room and we'll collect all those ideas. Like, that is one way of collecting a bunch of ideas. There's also a cool model called, what is it, the 1 2 1 2 4 all model. I don't know if anyone, you could put in the chat if you've been anywhere where this has happened, but especially great for those of us who are introverts, where you've used this. Yes, Lindsay, it's well, I don't know how you felt about it, but I loved it. Where basically it's for like brainstorming and idea generation, but you have people first take 2-3 minutes to reflect themselves, come up with a couple of ideas. You write on like post-it notes. Then liberating structure is nice. They have a lot of great resources, but where then you pair up, and between the two of you, you come up with, you talk about your ideas, you can fine tune them a little bit, but then in the pair, and I don't want to get this wrong, but then each member of the pair promotes an idea to a group of 4 then, and it can't have been your own idea. It has to be one of the ones that your partner had come up with. And so it's a really cool way of sort of building and prioritizing and sharing ideas in a way that lets everyone has to have contributed, right? So like you get people who are sort of the quieter ones, or who need that moment to reflect before they're happy or willing to share their idea in a big space. Anyway, so there are tools like that where you can become a better facilitator yourself, without necessarily having to hire a new person. That said, I do hope, and I think the trajectory of the space is moving more into a place that appreciates that is an important role to fund and play.
Great. I am so excited to get all of these resources personally.
They're good, right? Yeah. But it does take time to learn too. It's not a zero cost again.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, no, I love this. I love this. I'm so glad that I get to ask these questions of you. So a question from Dave Jones: when you co-produce something, how do you suggest making the results or sustainable? So this gets a little bit, I think, to some of the funding questions we already talked about. Should there be long-term commitments ahead of time for funding prior to the engagement, or are there alternate methods to make things like this sustainable?
Is this sustainability of the product, whatever is being co-produced, or sustainability of like the partnership?
Personally, I'm interested in both. I think he was thinking a little bit more about if there was a product, product sustainable, but personally, I'm personally interested in both. So we can start with the result.
Yeah. That's so this is one that comes up a lot, especially, right, because I was talking earlier, like one of the benefits of co-production is that you get this like shared ownership and everyone feels like they kind of own the product, and that's great for uptake. It's also something of a diffusion of responsibility when it comes to who actually needs to own it and maintain it moving forward. So this is for some things, this is not as critical. Like if the product is a static object, right? And you're like, we did the thing, we built the thing, you hand it off, they can use it sort of in perpetuity or for a very, right? So in some cases, this isn't a problem. But especially if so some of the ones I'm thinking of are like, if there's so I'm part of a group called the Ecological Forecasting Initiative, and sometimes you're using like, you're producing ecological forecasts, and they're whatever, they're ideally the data keep coming in because you're being fed from, one of these, like monitoring systems that's set up by governments. And so there's like presumably a constant data flow until such time as that data source gets shut down by whoever's running it. But ideally, you could run this product for you, or you could update that product for as long as those data are available. But that's expensive, right? You have to have server space, you have to be running the models, you have to be storing the output somewhere, right? There's often like an interface that gets involved. And so that is really tricky. That is, so yeah, again, maybe not an easy answer, and it'll probably be tailored to kind of whatever the type of product you're talking about is. And one of the solution spaces that's out there is, and actually, did I work with Dave? Anyway, the it's like I might know where this question is coming from, but the where you the sort of the end user that would care the most about this, either because they're like, so maybe this is something that's going to be hosted by NOAA because it's a core product related to something that's in their remit. And if you can convince them of that, and maybe they're part of that co-production process. So this is a little bit of that iteration piece where, like, as you're building a thing, if it is something that does need to sort of exist in perpetuity, you do have to be thinking of, or one of a key thing you could be thinking of is who should be that final owner, or like who do you hope to hand it off to do that maintenance into the future, and to see if you can bring them on, or at least like let them, give them a hand in it, right? Let them have some sort of say, even if it's just inviting them to, periodic update things. And this is where I have the really cool diagram that I may or may not be in my slides, but I've seen it. It was produced by the Nature Conservancy, and it's basically like a ladder of engagement where it goes to like zero consultation, just a pure handoff, all the way to like completely owned by that end user. And like it was completely driven, the whole project is completely driven by that end user. And then kind of the part that I like about it is that there's a line on it that's like, what's the message that you're sending with those types of engagement, like what they hear. And so from the like zero engagement is like, we don't care what you think, is basically the message that they're hearing. Like, you're not relevant, you're not involved, all the way to like, this is your thing. We're here to help if you want. And if you don't, we also don't have to be here, right? And so I think for me, that's been a really helpful sort of shorthand, that not invited here, no, not invented here, oh, can I go off mute? I would just, anyway, I would love to talk about that. Yes, the kind of the message that different people hear based on their level of engagement, and what that means for their sense of long-term ownership too. So like, and sometimes you just need to give the right people enough lead time to like put things up their own chain. So like there's stuff where like I would love to be involved, but technically I need sign off from my senior VP, who's currently and for the next month going to be out for X period of time. And when he gets back, I am not his highest priority. So like my ask has to, like, I would have to like shop it around with a bunch of people internally. And so I think some of that is like the lead time. But that's hard, right? You might not know who the appropriate maintainer of this product is until you don't have enough time to give them the lead time that they need to get the thing. So you can have stopgap solutions. It's not easy. I think the being reflective and thoughtful and having the right people in the room, and like, and also this is a place where I don't think I talked about this in the talk, but being really, I think I've seen a lot of fear around like not over promising. And so because you don't want to over promise, you kind of don't engage early on. I get that. I think that's a totally legitimate concern. And in my experience, people are way more sort of understanding and forgiving of uncertainty as long as that uncertainty is communicated to them individually, right? So like you can talk about that the public doesn't do great with kind of understanding what uncertainty means and like how to interpret it. But I think individually, if you're talking about a potential partnership, if you can have that kind of one-on-one or small group candid conversation, I have found people to be really pretty responsive with and understanding, like, okay, like I won't invest a lot in this now because maybe it won't go forward or maybe it will, but I'll, you know, I'm happy to iterate. I'm happy to have a 1 hour call with you to talk about like major red flags or major use cases or something like that, right? Where you get like a broad strokes sense of the extent to which different groups should be involved. And then you can sort of let people self-select in a little bit too. This is, I'm now drifting farther away from, I think, a response to your actual question, but that kind of, I did just want to highlight that like honest sense of sort of where things are and what level, where the again, back to that sort of constraints to like what are the actual constraints and what are the things that like we're hoping to get around this one, but right now we're constrained by X, I think is also really legit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that struck me within your answer is, the ability, it's important to be adaptable and agile in how we are going about this type of work, maybe
Yeah.
even more so than in some other spaces
Mhm.
that we have done. Um, so how would you suggest the introduction of co-production with rapidly developing initiatives such as AI?
Mhm.
Or if you want to take it a slightly different way, it's like, how can you pivot to co-production in a space where it hasn't necessarily been the norm? So kind of similar questions, but like a little bit hacks. And so I'll kind of let you choose which way you want to go on that.
Yeah. Can you read the one, the AI one again?
So, introduction of co-production with rapidly developing initiatives, such as AI,
Okay.
or or pivoting into spaces where it hasn't been the norm to do co-production.
Yeah. I so I'm trying to think if like the model of how you would go about doing it is fundamentally different when things are like so the AI one I'm not even sure I'm understanding if I'm understanding it correctly, it's like how would you like quickly integrate a rapidly
Yeah,
evolving like kind of technology into
that's my understanding of the question too.
space? That's interesting.
Because it's like my sense.
Yeah.
I'm interpreting Dave's question here a little bit. uh, Co-production often involves a little bit more time,
Yeah.
be more thoughtful and cautious, or
Mhm.
not cautious, but contemplative about how you're going about things. But there are initiatives that are so rapid and fast paced, and the dynamics are changing so
Mhm.
immediately.
Mhm.
Um, how is it? How can you be effective? How
Yeah.
can you develop an effective co-production model?
Yeah. So my initial thought for that is so the pace issue I think is really interesting. So this is one thing where um there are all sorts of so basically the issue of trust comes in here in my mind, in part because you might have, and this is apologies if this is not answering the actual question that was asked, but the thing this makes me think of is if you have like some parties in a co-production activity who are adopting something or moving ahead with something that the other parties don't fully understand or aren't super comfortable with themselves. And ideally, okay, maybe this is more, yeah. So anyway, so my initial thought is that it's around, so there's an issue of sort of trusted partner here, that co-production can be really slow. It also, there's the phrase like moving at the pace of trust, which tends to be really slow, especially at the beginning. And what you characterize as the beginning depends a lot on how long you think this thing is going to last, right? Like if you have something that's the whole co-production process has to be wrapped up in like 1 year, then going slowly and something taking 6 months is like a huge chunk of time, right? That's like half of your time to get to like agreeing on the vision statement. You're like, we only have 6 months left. Oh my God. And you can get like panic and things like that. I will say like that is 100% real, right? There are things where like you don't have the time to move at the pace that you kind of feel like you need to do co-production right, maybe a separate kettle of fish. And I will say too that like once that trust has been established, you can also move incredibly fast because now people are just sort of doing their thing and everyone trusts each other. do, this is a bit rosy, but where then people basically are trusting each other to do their thing, and they don't need the, basically what you're saying is like you invest the trust building first, like you do that through co-creating a vision, you do that through talking through your theory of change, you do that through the discussion of roles and responsibilities and those frequent check-ins. But that's like it, a lot of that is about building the trust and the language, right? Like how do we talk about this? What's our shared understanding? How do we discuss it? What's our shorthand? What does this collaboration look like, right? But then at some point you can also move pretty quickly. And I would say the introduction of new technologies or tools maybe is easier in that back end when it can be an individual partner bringing something in to say like, hey, I've started using this tool. But the other partner is already, they're like, okay, if you think that that fits within your purview of the thing that you want to do, we trust you. Like that's, now we know each other, and that's not as big a deal as it might have been if you introduce it in the beginning, or like if it comes in during that trust building phase. And I don't know if that is, if that gets at that answer, but I do think like the timing of the introduction of some of those things can be really critical. And it's not always that just everything takes a lot longer in co-production. It can be that you get like that beginning phase where like in a top down thing, right? Like someone's going to tell you what the vision is, and they're going to be like, this is our vision, this is what we're doing, this is our roles and responsibilities. Now we spend a year implementing. Whereas like in co-production, you're not going to get that, right? Because there is no top down, ideally. You're spending that time, but as you're spending that time doing all that stuff that takes that all that extra time, you're also building the trust that allows you to move faster and more efficiently on the back end, I think. I don't know
Yeah,
if that actually answers it, but
you know, to me, what that reminds me of is, you know, taking the time, you know, right now to, you know, set up a code or a process or a routine to do something that you know you're going to be doing a lot of. The individual task maybe doesn't take very long right now. Setting up this coding might take like 5 times as long, but over the long term, it's going to end up saving you a lot of time. And it's like an investment in your future by taking the time now.
yeah.
And making that argument can be difficult, I think, sometimes for some people to accept. Susan has a great comment in chat about, you know, it's like we can't go fast enough, but the need to slow down to effective community engagement and that trust building. You know, finding that right balance between people who are demanding some sort of results in a particular time frame, when you know, it could, instead of being a linear curve, it could be exponential if you take that time at the start. So I think it's trying to find that balance there. We have a couple other questions in the Slido. We will share them with you, and we will allow you figure out a way for you to get some of those answers back to us.
Yeah, happy to.
We're going to set up some connections with other people. It's like I look forward to more conversations with you personally. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I wanted to give you a minute. If there's anything that you thought of that's like, oh, I wish I could share this, I'll just give you a minute to do that right now before we kind of do some announcements.
Sure. I mean, I no final sort of pivotal nuggets of wisdom, I guess. Just, I mean, reiterating like the grace and accountability piece. Also happy to chat with anyone about this at any time too. So if you find yourselves, you know, wanting to talk, I think my last, anyway, the slides I shared, you'll share, well, it's transcribed anyway.
We'll share them.
You'll hopefully get my contact information.
We'll get them shared for you. But
feel free to reach out.
Please join me in kind of giving a virtual applause to Kira again. This was a really wonderful, and there's so many great connections between the talk you gave today, and our breakout sessions, and our first plenary from the American Red Cross. Like all of this, you know, I love how this is all coming together so well.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Kira. I hope we see you involved more in ESIP in the future.
It'd be great. Thank you so much.
Great. And so now before y'all go off for your break, we have some announcements. First off, for For those of you who joined our coffee break networking session on Tuesday, we have another one on Thursday. You missed out if you didn't join us. Some great conversations, great way to meet. It's hard to have those kind of hallway conversations in a virtual meeting, and this is a way that you can do that. If you have a topic that you'd love to talk some more about, please propose. Birds of a feather before the end of this coming break. We've got great sessions coming up this afternoon. 2 groupings of sessions. Please. There's like 6 of them that I want to go to. Actually, I don't think there's a single one that I don't want to participate in. So I'm really glad that they're going to be recorded. So hopefully there's some choices for you. Again, sign up for Birds of a Feather. Can we go to the next slide? If you haven't seen this, we have our t-shirt fundraiser going on right now. And it's not just t-shirts this time. We have selections. We have short sleeve, long sleeve, pullover, sweatshirts. Please, these are great shirts. If you've ever gotten a shirt from this fundraiser before, they're high quality shirts. They're super comfy. And I love the fact that we have a little bit more choice in product. And one of the fabulous things, when you order your t-shirt or sweatshirt, you can actually make an additional donation to ESIP. We've talked a little bit about diversifying funding. We talked about that a little bit with Kira in some of the other sessions. I've heard this come up. This is a very small way that we can help diversify some of ESIP's funding, which is particularly critical right now. It's also the only fundraiser that we do. So please, this isn't like NPR pledge support. We're not here every day asking for stuff. Next slide. And don't forget tomorrow, one of my favorite parts, one of the things I really appreciate about being ESIP president is I get to help present some of our peer recognition awards. And it is such an exciting thing for me to get to do, to thank and recognize people who are doing really great things as part of ESIP. We have a lot of really great things coming tomorrow. We encourage you to be there to celebrate your peers and to be part of some of the conversations that we will have there about successful collaboration. And if you want a sneak peek of who's coming, check out that link that Allison just dropped in chat, and be sure to join us tomorrow to celebrate them virtually. And we'll get to celebrate them in person in July in Seattle. And with that, I will see some of you in sessions this afternoon. And hopefully I will see everybody at the closing plenary tomorrow. Thank you very much. And talk to you soon.